Kubernetes for Humans.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Kubernetes for Humans podcast. My name is Itiel Schwartz, and today with me in the show we have Dan. Dan, can you please introduce yourself?
Hey, everybody. My name is Dan Ciruli, and I am a Senior Director of Product Management at Nutanix. I lead our cloud-native product management team. Great to be here today.
That's cool. Like, we don't have a lot of product people in the podcast, so it's like nice to have diversity, right? And also for products. And maybe let's get started to get to know you a bit better. Like, share with us, where did you start? What do you do? Maybe, yeah, like later on, let's talk about what is Nutanix, because I think some folks maybe didn't really heard about it. But let's start talking with you. Yeah, share your
Great.
story.
One of my favorite subjects. I started like a lot of product managers in tech, especially in the Kubernetes side of tech. Studying computer science, and I was an engineer for about 10 years. It's a long time ago, well before Kubernetes. And I gradually got into product management. It really happened that in my first startup I was at, we didn't have this concept of product management in the 90s. It really wasn't a well-known thing. And so when you led a product, you kind of talked to customers to figure out what it needed to do. You designed the architecture for it, and you led the team that was going to build it, right? You kind of did all those things. And my friends and I, who had this company, we sold it, and I took some time off, which was nice. Went on tour with a rock band. There's a platinum record in the background there. Which is pretty fun. I came back, so they're a band called Chevelle, and they had a platinum record in 2003. Spent a crazy year. I spent a year on the road with a rock band. It was wild. And I came back, and my friends were starting another company, and they said, "Hey, we're just starting a new company. It's Grid Computing. You should join." And I said, "Okay, great." I mean, they're good friends, right? It worked out well the first time. But I said, of all the stuff I did at the last company, I think I like the outward-facing stuff the most. So I want to be in product management, and they're like, "Okay, you're a product manager." So I was director of product. I had never even worked with a product manager. That company built some cool stuff, but didn't end up being commercially successful. And then when I went to get a job at a real company, it was EMC at the time, I was a product manager, and I've been it ever since. I really liked it. EMC led me to Google. Google was, EMC, I learned a lot about product management, actually, just from the people I was around. Not that they necessarily had a great culture, but I ended up being on a really great team, built a great team. And then I went to Google, and Google was interesting for totally different reasons, right? You don't learn how to be a product manager at Google, for sure. But the technology is really interesting. My team built and ran Google's API infrastructure and service mesh. So all Google APIs came across our API proxy effectively. And then when we needed to design a new architecture for performance reasons, and we moved to more of a service mesh architecture, they built that. So that was really interesting. I had to learn a lot technically. And then Google, became Google Cloud and started working in open source. So then we turned to open source, right? And we're like, okay, and every team did this. Every team was like, okay, what are we doing? How do we open source it, right? The Borg team obviously made Kubernetes.
Yeah.
So what did we do? Well, I was one of the founders of the Open API initiative. So you probably know the Open API specification. I represented Google on that board, the board that is the kind of, the ward of the spec. And then
I'm not sure, like, who owns like the Open API? Like, who is it?
It is in the CNCF. Lots of people don't realize it's a CNCF project. Yeah, it was always Linux Foundation, and now is in the CNCF. And then we open sourced gRPC from our group, and I was first product manager on that and handed that off very quickly because I just had too much going on. And then next was Istio, and the team had built Google's internal service mesh, so they built something similar in Istio. And so I was on the steering committee for Istio for several years.
I don't like Istio, then. I'll be honest here. Like, it's one of the things that, it's, I'm not sure if it's like unpopular or very popular opinion, but Istio is like the most successful Kubernetes project that I think people don't like. Like it's
I
really
agree. It is the only thing more popular than Istio is not liking Istio for very good reasons, by the way. And we can talk about that later if you want to. My friends will get really mad at me, but we can talk about why that is. So anyway, then I was at Google for 7 years, left there, been at a couple places since. I went to a company called D2IQ, which was formerly known as Mesosphere. Mesosphere, built on the Mesos project, a project which did not win the container orchestration wars. And the company had pivoted to be on Kubernetes. It was called D2IQ. And last year we were. Go
let's
ahead.
stop for a second just for maybe like our younger listeners. I'm not sure how many are those. But maybe if you can give like a glimpse on like the container wars, who was there, and then talk a bit about the pivot, because for me it was always weird. Like in the end of the day, it doesn't really, like
Right. Yeah. So
yeah, if you can share a bit about the if you want, I can, but I feel that you live that.
yeah, no. I mean, I'll be happily hear your perspective. Your perspective is really, your perspective is your vision from where you stand, right? That's literally what it means. And your perspective is your vision from where you stand. So in the beginning, I remember, of course, Google had adopted containers very early on. Did a lot of work to get C groups into the Linux kernel. Like Google was a big adopter of containers. But I remember the first time a team from Docker came over to Google and did a demonstration of Docker, like a really focused on making it easy to use. And I remember people being pretty blown away. And Docker got adoption very quickly for a lot of different reasons. But as your listeners all know, putting something in a container that's not how not enough. You have to figure out how to get it to a node somewhere to put it in production, right? Like fundamentally, that's what container orchestration is. Hey, we need to put this somewhere. If that thing goes away, we need to bring it up again. If we need a lot of them, we need to make a lot of them, right? Like that's ultimately what container orchestration is. So in the beginning, there were different projects at doing this. And, Docker Swarm was an example. And the other one was this project, Mesos, which was another Linux Foundation project. Mesos had some academics in it. There's a PhD student at Berkeley, had some people in I was going to say enterprise, but we didn't think of it as enterprise back then. We thought of them as web companies, right? Twitter, Airbnb, companies who were running extremely large scale for the time, extremely high traffic sites, had realized how useful containers were for reliably getting things to production, reliably running them. And Mesos was a project that was a container orchestration, real emphasis on scalability. It really was, it's what made Twitter, able to get from where, remember in the beginning of Twitter, it crashed all the time. And when they adopted, the fail whale. Yeah. Like it used to be a joke, and containers is what saved them, right? And Mesos is what saved them. So some people left the Mesos project, left Twitter, left Airbnb, and created Mesosphere, a company aimed at kind of commercializing this open source project. And early on, it had the lead. It was definitely the one that was kind of doing the best, getting big adoption. Apple, federal government, huge deployments. I think I've heard of 10,000 node Mesos clusters. I don't think I've ever heard of a 10,000 node Kubernetes cluster to this day, right? Emphasis on scale, emphasis on storage, like it was good. But then Google open source Kubernetes. And it was the team that built Borg, obviously also very, very, very scalable. Kubernetes did not start very scalable.
No.
In my opinion, what made Kubernetes so successful was Craig McCluskey's insistence on creating the CNCF and getting effectively every tech company except Amazon behind it. Amazon wasn't behind it in the beginning. They didn't like it. But getting IBM and Microsoft and Oracle and even Mesos was part of the CNCF, Mesosphere, like just getting all these big companies to say, yes, that will be effectively the API. Kubernetes will be the API for putting a container on a node, right? Like that was really the thing that I think made Kubernetes successful, was the CNCF. Saying we'll create an organization, and that organization won't just host this, it'll host everything, because Kubernetes isn't ready to go to production, right? It doesn't solve security problems. It doesn't solve observability problems. It doesn't solve all the networking problems. The CNCF gave an umbrella where anyone could create an open source project to start to solve those problems. And it marketed itself very well. And so, the like KubeCons became very exciting. And I really do think, the CNCF was really the genius. When I think about what's going on in the CNCF, 100 plus, almost 200 projects now, 1,200 companies or something. It is the largest, most innovative software development project that has ever happened, right? Think of it that way, because they're all working towards an end. Like, they're different directions. It's messy, but you've got 100,000 developers all working on one thing. That's never happened before. The innovation is incredible, and that's because of the CNCF, and that's why Kubernetes won. And it's a great thing. Like, I don't look back on that. I think that's great.
No, like it's a interesting take. Like, to be honest, I don't really know. I know that Docker Swarm had its own issues, but Mesos, I'll be honest, I never like played with it in production. Even when I like chose, like I played with Docker, I played with Kubernetes, but that's pretty much it. So it's like an interesting take on the CNCF. But now let's do like a bit of a fast forward. So Kubernetes won, right? And then
Kubernetes
this
won.
like you need to understand like what to do now. So maybe
Yeah. So I wasn't at D2IQ, by the way, at the time. I didn't join until they pivoted. My background was in the cloud native Kubernetes world, right? So that's when I became relevant to them. But they had a choice. It was obvious that sticking on Mesos would have been a no growth, right? They had some big customers. They had good business. They could have said, okay, we'll stay on this, be a single company open source project, and ride it out. But it's not an exciting path. And some founders decided to leave, and some founders decided to stay and say, hey, we've already got some good customers. We have really good experience, and we have, a great support organization, some great SRE, some great engineers. Let's just try and solve the same problems on Kubernetes. And that was the pivot, right? They changed the name. I love the name Mesosphere. I still think Mesosphere is a great name. I wish they'd kept the name, but yeah, it has the word Mesos in it. So then concentrated on trying to make the cloud native ecosystem, trying to make Kubernetes usable. I love the name of this podcast. I love the slogan for Commodore, this Kubernetes for humans, right? The thing I said about the CNCF is true. It is the most innovative, writ large, the most innovative software project ever. But it's not a software project. It's hundreds of software projects, each of them built independently by independent people with different ideas technically, different ideas from business, because everybody's in there for a reason. And ultimately, it's all business, right? Everybody releases on a different schedule. People have different build systems. People have different philosophies. It's messy. And so there's lots of innovation, but there's plenty of room for commercial companies to come in and say, okay, how do we make this usable, right? How do you turn this crazy consortium of independent software projects into something that enterprises can use? For big clouds, that's obvious. For big clouds, you run it as a service, right? Every big cloud, that's how they can take this and make it usable. Well, they run it for you, right? But there is still so much room for companies to come in. Some, and fundamentally, like, it might be some open source, some not open source. How do you take this innovation, make it so people stay current, so they're on current technology, but it's actually usable, right? They can use it. The big enterprise can use it. So the average developer can use it. The average SRE can use it. And that's where D2IQ decided, hey, we can do that. We can work on making this stuff usable and adoptable by governments, by big enterprises, and so they stuck around, and I joined, and then last year Nutanix bought us.
Okay, so let's talk about like the latest like turnaround, I think, of like D2IQ, which again, like, it's crazy. But yeah, what happened? Who is Nutanix? Why would they bought them? And
So Nutanix is a very interesting company. They were started by some ex-Google engineers, some engineers who looked at how Google stored data and said, this is cool. Google stored data with this system we called Google File System, or GFS. And GFS effectively stored data with really high quality, great resilience, and good performance across commodity hardware. And at the time, your listeners are probably too young to remember this, but for those of us who were grown-ups in, say, 2004, when Google hit its stride, like, it was around since 99 or something, but by 2004, it was the biggest site on the internet, I would guess, by 2004. And at the time, it was shocking because most big companies at that point, as they went to the internet, they were buying millions and millions of dollars of hardware from like EMC for storage and Cisco for networking. And you needed to buy big iron to put anything on the web to scale, right? It was the only way. Google didn't do that. Google bought commodity hardware, ran Linux boxes. It was shocking at the time. Like people were just writing articles like it's incredible, right? Where other people, these vendors are going in and buying these $1 million servers. Google's like, no, we're buying $1,000 servers. We're just buying a lot of them. We're stacking them up. And how did they solve the problem? Of reliability and do it? Well, they did two things. They wrote GFS. They did more than two things, but one thing they wrote GFS. They stored data on commodity hardware. They found ways that when you write something, you write it more than once, right? Effectively is what it comes down to, which is what RAID does within a drive, but it's the same thing across nodes. If a node fails, it doesn't matter because you already wrote it somewhere else. Something else can read it somewhere else. You've got a system for pulling it, right? And so they wrote GFS, and some people internal to Google say, hey, this is really cool that we get such amazing storage from from commodity hardware. We should start a company. So they left and they started Nutanix. And that's how Nutanix started was storage. Now, all of those nodes that are storing your data now also have CPUs in them, and they can also do compute. So soon after, Nutanix added a virtualization layer, a hypervisor called AHV, built on KVM, and so now they had this thing where similar to Google, except it wasn't container based in the beginning; it was VM based, but it was a way to take commodity hardware and just put lots of VMs across them and lots of and storage. They called it hyper-converged infrastructure because it was doing storage, it was doing the networking, and it was doing the virtualization itself, the compute, all on commodity hardware. So you didn't have to go to a virtualization, like a VMware. You didn't have to buy your compute cluster, a big storage cluster, and then buy big networking things. It was all on commodity hardware, and it was called hyper-converged infrastructure. Kind of created that category, and Nutanix has something like 26,000 customers, a couple $1 billion a year in sales. Don't quote me on that, but it's public. It's a public company. You can go look it up. Has done very well for the last 15 years in getting enterprises to be able to get the most, again, out of commodity hardware, just buying Linux boxes.
Mhm. Okay, so so far I understand everything, but why D2IQ, right? And Nutanix, like why is it a good fit? From what you're saying, why not buy another like infrastructure company or whatever
Great.
that it's better?
It's a great question. So as I said, Nutanix has thousands of customers, people who are deploying mostly VMs and they've got storage. So since Kubernetes, Kubernetes has gone from a science project, like when it was released, back in the day, Joe Beta and Tim Hawken, it was very much Brendan Burns, very much a science project at first, right? And then crazy companies started using it, and then big companies started using it, and it has quickly evolved. It's 10 years old now. It is now the de facto way people write new software. They write software to be deployed in containers. To be clear, you don't write software for Kubernetes, but you write it to be, you build it so it can be containerized. The benefits are great, right? This ability to just like quickly, we could get into it, but your listeners all know the benefits of Kubernetes. So everything new is being written in Kubernetes. And Nutanix is, the kind of the mission statement for Nutanix, which I keep on my wall, by the way. Every company, I always have the mission statement on the wall. I actually love mission statements. I know it's dumb. We get into some other like philosophy of running a company.
Yeah,
Sometimes
it's like
I think
talking like a true PM, like
it is true. Like everybody at Google knew Google's mission, right? And when I went to Zora, everybody knew the mission. It really helps people to know, am I doing something that's right? By the way, Google's forgotten their mission statement. Like that's one of the reasons it's not the company that it used to be. Anyway, essentially, Nutanix wants to help our customers run any workload anywhere, because now it's software, right? You can run it in the cloud, you can run it on-prem, and we have lots of customers who run it at the edge. And you and I were talking about edge earlier, right? Lots of customers do that. Well, nowadays, running software means not just VMs, it means containers. You have to have a good way to do it. All the new software is written in Kubernetes. Most enterprises, still 90+% of what they're running in total is in VMs, right?
Yep.
Vast majority. However, VMs aren't growing anymore. Containers are growing very quickly. And, not only is essentially, a vast majority of the new stuff being written in containers, sometime, like by the end of this decade, the number of, I think of it in terms of cores, the number of cores running containers will be higher than the number of cores running VMs. Like it's going to overtake it.
Yeah.
VMs will never go away, or at least they won't go away for a couple of decades. People talk about re-architecture. We could spend a few minutes talking about it. Personally, I don't think it's ever going to happen. If you're running an app in a VM, an old enterprise app, it's going to run in a VM until you end of life it. But the replacement is going to be in containers. So if Nutanix's goal is to help our customers run any workload anywhere, they got to have a good container story. They got to have a good story for how we're going to help customers manage a world in which in IT, in operations, which now includes platform engineering, you're running VMs and you're running containers, but you got to do it all, right? So Nutanix needed that. So they were slowly building their own Kubernetes practice, but they didn't have the people. It was much better for them to make an acquisition and say, let's bring in a bunch of engineers who know what they're doing, a fully formed product that's already in production, in some real interesting use cases, and integrate that. And so that's what they did. They reached out, they got us, and it's been a really good fit, technically and culturally, a really good fit.
Yeah. So how is it like moving, from a startup in the end of the day to like a big company doing like big company stuff, right?
So for the most part, it's good. Like for the most part, like I said, technically really good, very little overlap in what we are doing. The kind of integration points are very clear and obvious and technically, accomplishable. So technically fits in really well. We have gotten amazing support from top executives. Like it is really because I've been part of acquisitions on both sides before. I've been acquired before, as I mentioned. At Google, we acquired Apigee. I was on the acquisition team when we bought the company Apigee, which is a $600 million acquisition. It was, and so I've seen how it can go, both ways. This has worked really well, and one of the reasons is that our top executives understand how strategically important it is, right? If we stayed in a VM based world, we would be kind of like we describe it as like you'd just be riding the train out of town, right? Like you'd be riding the VM train out of town. It's going to get smaller and smaller and smaller over the next 2 decades. But if we want to stay relevant, then being serious about container management, Kubernetes management is very important. So very much supported at the very highest level, which has been really nice. They get on stage at our marketing events and they talk about your product. All you want, like if you have your CEO talking about your product at your marketing events, like leading off, you're in a pretty sweet spot. And so we've had that very much too.
No, that's the dream when someone acquire you, right? Like not
Right.
being a pet project and being something that is like moving the business. And so, maybe like from the Nutanix point of view, you did touch about it a bit, but what are the trends that you are seeing in the Kubernetes market or like the
So
compute
there is a study that was done last year, and people are always doing, surveys. I shouldn't say study. This was a survey done last year by one of the vendors and then published by one of the things. I'm sorry that I don't remember it. I'm going to quote the numbers and not remember who did the study. I read it on the news stack, but it wasn't their study. I think it was another vendor's study. And there were 2 numbers that jumped out at me. One, and I'm curious to know what you think about this. One was they asked people, and the survey was of companies running Kubernetes in production. So these aren't like general enterprises like, hey, if you're running Kubernetes in production, 92% said they don't want developers managing infrastructure. And it's not surprising, but in the beginning of Kubernetes, developers did manage infrastructure. And when I say infrastructure, I'm including Kubernetes, right? In the beginning, if you wanted to run Kubernetes, I think this is how DevOps, the phrase DevOps kind of started, right? Was, hey, you want to run that, that's fine. You're going to be the developer and the operator. Like you're going to write the software, but you're also going to install Kubernetes and you're going to carry the pager because no one else knows what to do if there's, if a container goes down, if you're getting a crash loop reset, right? So a decade into running it, I think, vast majority of companies are saying we don't want developers doing that. We want centralized IT, right? And if you look at how big companies run, look at how Google runs. The developers don't run Borg. You've got SREs for that, right? You want dedicated people who are running that. Now you have platform engineering. You want your platform engineering team. You want consistency in how Kubernetes clusters are run. You want people who understand them well. When there's a a CDE, you want to know, okay, we took care of it, right? Because our clusters are centralized. So that 92% is a really big deal. That tells you want enterprise, you want I'll call it IT, but you want a centralized Kubernetes.
One
And
second.
then the other,
one second. Just my wife. Hey, Mom? Camp? אני ממש באמצע שיחה, באמצע פודקאסט. רבע שעה? 6:30. ביי.
now I know the Hebrew word for podcast.
Hebrew word for podcast is skit. It's like very not being used in like
No, you said, I didn't understand a word there except for podcast.
Nah. Yeah, so sorry, I like interrupted.
Yeah, no, that's so good. I was about to make a second point anyway. Udi, you can edit this easy. And let's see, what did I say? I had said, oh yeah, so you had 92%. The other number that is very interesting is it was in the high 80s, like 86% of companies using Kubernetes say they want to run VMs and containers on the same infrastructure. And that's pretty obvious too, right? Like you said, like you're running, if you're an enterprise today, you're running a lot of VMs. Most of what you're running in your data center is VMs, but you are running some containers and you're going to be running more and more. You don't want to, you want things to be movable. You want to be able to buy a rack of servers and say, I can run workloads over there. And it doesn't matter if they're in a VM or the container, I can run any of them. You don't want to buy separate. And it sounds kind of crazy, but now that I'm in a company that deals with people who populate data centers, there are companies who buy racks and say, okay, we're going to have Kubernetes running here and we're going to have VMs running over on this other rack. And then if one is full and the other one has capacity, there's nothing you can do about it, right? So it's those two numbers really that are telling Nutanix this is very important, and these are the problems that we need to solve, right? So Nutanix customers have always been infrastructure operators. They're in INO, as they say, infrastructure and operations. Some people call them sysadmins, some people call them cloud admins. But what our goal is to give those people everything they need to run enterprise systems in production. That includes software they're writing. It includes COTS software that they buy, but they have to install and run. And, it includes all that. And we want to make sure that they can run everything securely, that networking and monitoring is handled. And that, yes, they can take on new workloads, whether they're running in Kubernetes, they're running in VMs. And as I said, VMs are not going away anytime soon. For the rest of my career, for the rest of your career, probably they'll be there. And so we know that IT departments are going to have to be wrestling with this. How do I run these VMs? How do I run these containers effectively? The other thing that's going to be going on for forever from now on is, where do I run workloads, right? I've got some stuff running on premises. In the beginning, we thought that was going to go away, but that's definitely not going away. And there's the cloud, which is super useful. You want to be able to use it for certain things. And what we're trying to do, kind of the big problem statement, is give IT departments tools to help them with both of those spectra of problems: VM, container, on-prem, in the cloud, edge.
No, I think that like it's not only that, like, I think most people don't, or most companies don't want their developers to manage infrastructure. I think they don't want their IT to manage infrastructure if they can. I think like the serverless Kubernetes is becoming, like, it's still early on because it doesn't really work as well as you want it to work. But like going forward, 4 years from now, 5 years from now, I think things like Google Autopilot, maybe Nutanix says you guys have your own like autopilot, but I think it is going to get much more adoption. Like even in Commodore, like I don't benefit from managing these like nodes and nodes pool. Like I don't get any business value out of it.
Right.
And I think as the technology improves, this thing that is currently like that's life, right? Like you want to run software, you need to do it, and like other solutions are quite shitty. I think this is going to change, and like even operation people are going to manage less operation, or at least that's my hunch, right? I think like this is where we are going to, but in reality, like you said, for edge devices, for phones, for cash registers, like there is metal there, right? Like there is the machine running code somewhere.
There is. I mean, and ultimately we will be investing in technology to make that technology as invisible as possible, right? For sure. In the end, we used to say this at Istio, and we can get back and talk about Istio at some point. But at the Louis Ryan, who's one of the first two engineers on Istio, used to say, in the long run, we want this to be invisible. We don't want people to think about it. You want it to go away. You want the benefits. You want features. People want security. They just want security, right? If they want to see what's going on, they want observability. They shouldn't have to think about all the plumbing. Kubernetes is certainly getting better and is improving, but there's still a ton of it. It's still, it requires a lot of expertise. And in time, the number of people who need that expertise should go down and go down and go down.
Yeah,
And,
I think we're seeing the phase that it's going to go way up, and then like hopefully it is going to go down, or that's what I think.
It will have to go way up because of that the adoption curve, right? The adoption curve is set. Everybody is writing for it. And so the number of containers is exploding. Whether you want it to be easy or not, you have to run them right now. And companies like yours and mine, this is just opportunity, right? There's this, like that's what we're trying to do is we want to make it easy. Like I fully acknowledge it's too hard, fully acknowledge Istio came out of the gate way too hard, way too complicated.
Way too hard. Like to be honest, like we did run a bit out of time here. Like usually it's like 30 minutes episodes. So no, it's fine. And also like we had all of those breaks. So maybe then like and Woody like edit everything here, Woody. But
Yeah, Udi, go.
and maybe
Udi.
maybe so I ask you like the last question, like, and we did talk a bit about the future, but maybe share like something that something that's from your own on the ecosystem, like a prediction, something you like, shout out, whatever you like. Like we did talk a lot about predictions, so usually this is how I end the episode, but in this case, the floor is yours.
So I think that ultimately Kubernetes is the API and the API server. And I think that we're already seeing a little bit of this, but I think we're going to see more than we even imagine. That we're going to see lots and lots of implementations that look very different from each other. You mentioned phones before. We're all wearing a smart watch. I think that this adoption of the Kubernetes API as the way you take a workload and you say declaratively, here's a thing I want to run and here's how I want it to run, and you give it to a system. I think that will get more adoption than we ever really realized. And when we'll know success has really happened is when there are implementations that are completely custom on the back end, right? That you don't even know, is it Kubernetes running? It doesn't matter if it's Kubernetes running. If you can give it that thing and it'll run, and it's the same kind of general descriptor for I'm running an application that's going to serve, hundreds of millions of people in a data center, or it's going to go to, 50 million different watches, or it's going to go to the cars from my manufacturer. I ultimately think the ultimate success for Kubernetes will be that it's not in those bits, not in kubelet and in the API server itself, but rather the API will have lots of different implementations, but that will be that declarative deployment of applications and everything surrounding them. Like that's where I think we get eventually. And it'll be Kubernetes in a dominant way for a long time, but ultimately I think the API is the wave of the future.
Okay, with that great ending, I think we'll wrap it out. Dan, it's been a pleasure having you at the show. I think you gave a lot of like super interesting and different perspective, which are much more like high level. And I think it's like like the future will happen, right? So we'll come back here like a couple of years and see where we are. Thanks a lot, Dan.